So can we start by just talking a bit about your Guyanese heritage and think about how it shaped your interest in reclaiming kind of hidden histories?
Okay, so my dad is from Wakenham, a place called Mariah's Pleasure, and my mother was from Kitty, my late mother. She was recruited as a nurse as part of the Windrush generation. Yeah, so she came over and worked at St Thomas and Guy's, like many West Indians. And my dad came over as a study as a student in '61. And I suppose my interest in reclaiming hidden histories as a journalist, I studied for a history degree. There weren't media degrees when I was at university. So I studied for a history degree, and all that analysis and research helped me. But certainly I was concerned about the fact that not many English people knew where Guyana was on the map. Okay, so that spurred me on to do things about hidden histories. In 2016, I wrote a long read for The Guardian about Guyana's and Scotland's links. And I suppose that's where that interest came from, because Guyana has such an intrinsic value to Britain, and it's just not known about. So I think that's why, I spurred on to do that. In terms of my journalistic career, I started off in magazines, and then I worked for newspapers, and I was staff at The Guardian for a very, very long while. And I still write for the paper. I wrote Eric Huntley's obituary for the paper. And I suppose that spurred me on to think about hidden histories and people there. But in terms of working at a newspaper, what I realised, I started my journalism career in the early 90s. In the late 1990s, I did my first shift on a newspaper floor. I haven't published it in the book, but it was the independent newspaper. And there was only one other black person on that floor. Any other person of colour wielded a mop or worked in the canteen. So you see that it's a very important profession, journalism. You get to tell stories, you get to inform the public, you get to educate. You are narrating the first draft of history. And when the choices are made by people of a certain sector of society, that obscures the rest of society.
I was actually fascinated by the fact when you published that article on the connections between Scotland and Guyana that you managed to convince somebody to let you publish it. Because it was an unusual topic, and I don't know if anybody here had seen it, but it basically looked at Scotland. It was sort of Inverness, Cromarty, Tame, Kildonna, and all these places that map exactly on the coastline of Guyana. And it was just fascinating because I hadn't known of any of those connections before.
Yeah, I think because I'd been staff there and I'd been backbench, to explain, backbench are the people who check the paper. So we do all the headlines, we check it's legal, we rewrite the copy if it's not legible, and we send the paper at the end of the night. And if we don't send the paper on time, we get fined. So it's quite an important job. So I think that's why, they published it,
But so coming to this book, do you mind holding it up actually so the audience can see it? So with this book, I think it offers this kind of journalistic lineage that spans the late sort of 19th century to, I guess, 1980s.
Yes.
From, I've forgotten his name now, Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards to Darcus Howe.
Yeah.
Why is it that we know so little about these peoples? I just, first of all, I have to say, please, if you do get a chance, read the book because it's amazing, but also just really phenomenally insightful. I was just why don't we know these people?
Well, thanks, Juanita, for saying that. I appreciate it. In fact, this history, it doesn't really start with Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards. You could go right back to 1817 to the British-Jamaican journalist Robert Wedderburn, who wrote The Axlater Route, again, 6 anti-slavery pamphlets. But I decided to start it at Samuel Jules because he was so important and his story is so tragic. And he really, really fought for racial justice at a time in Victorian times, you know, and he was part of a huge progressive racial justice movement. And what was your question again, Juanita?
No, just why is it that we know so little about them?
We know so little about, so, I mean, particularly with Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards and Doucet Muhammad Ali, so we're talking late 19th century, early 20th century. Again, you've got the problem of archives, museums and educational institutions not preserving this history. Sadly, if we go back then, there was a racial hierarchy that existed because of colonialism. And, you know, these histories were not thought worthy to be preserved. So even something like the West Indian Gazette, which is a fairly recent publication, you know, it was published in 1958, you know, 70 years ago, there are only 4 complete runs of that in this country. And they are in an awful state, and 2 of them are duplicates. The microfilm at the British Library is battered beyond recognition. You can't even read some of it. When you think that Claudia Jones was an absolutely brilliant woman, she was a brilliant journalist, and that her journalism has not been preserved, it kind of makes you angry, and it does make you upset. So their newspapers weren't preserved. The history wasn't preserved. It wasn't valued in museums and educations and institutions. Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards, I couldn't find a complete run of his newspapers in this country, or Doucet Muhammad Ali's, despite them being produced here in the UK. I had to go all the way to America, to the States, and it was just by chance. I won't tell you the story because it's too long-winded and I don't want to take up too much time, but it was just by chance that the University of Illinois Newspapers and History Library had the full run of Fraternity, and only because somebody had found it in their attic, an Irishman, and donated it to the library. So these stories were hidden, they weren't preserved, because, I hate to say it, but our history wasn't valued.
I think that you mentioned one of the stories that you talk about that really shocked me was you said Stuart Hall had interviewed CLR James.
Yeah, that was so I saw that in the New Yorker, and it's about people who make decisions, who are in power, and it was a BBC commissioner at the time, and Stuart Hall had interviewed CLR James back in 1976, and they had the whole tape of the interview, and the guy wrote on the memo, this is the guy who was commissioning the programme, I'm not interested in a 360-degree conversation with CLR James. And that was lost. And then the journalist in question had to go through and recover that tape from the BBC. So that's the value, that's what you're up against when you're searching for these histories. And it took an awful long time. With Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards, I had 2 young kids at the time, they're over there now, they're grown up. But, you know, I started this when Freddie, my eldest, sort of started secondary school. I finished it when he completed his GCSEs. That was the amount of research it took. It took a year to do the Celestine Edwards chapter, another 6 months to do Doucet Muhammad Ali. It took a long time to recover these histories and put them in the domain. But their stories moved me to tears. I wanted to do it for the next generation, to say these stories are out there, dig around, see what you can find, because there's more work to be done.
So I just wanted to list the people that are covered. So we got Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards that you've talked about, Doucet Ali Muhammad, and then there's Claude McKay, George Padmore, Una Martin, Claudia Jones, Darcus Howe. And there are obviously 7 extraordinary journalists. But what I liked about your book as well is it points to other major figures who shaped kind of black political journalism in Britain, including people like CLR James, Ras McConnon, Andrew Salkey, John LaRose, and there's other people like that. And I was just wondering, how did you actually decide who to focus on?
It was really, really difficult. So initially I started this as a PhD project. I couldn't get the funding. I wanted to do it about black and brown newspapers. Then I focused on the people and the stories, and I thought they were really interesting. I got a bite from Faber, who wanted to publish it. They said, we're interested in the stories. We're interested in the stories of Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards. And when you do read it, it is like the real Bridgerton. It is absolutely nuts. It descends into something that you just think, oh my God, this has got tragedy, this has got love, this has got romance, this has got Ida B. Wells going, oh my God, what am I doing in the centre of this? It is just bonkers. And it's well worth reading. So I then focused on the people. And the thing that I wanted to link these people together was the struggle. Okay? So there was one point where the editor of Faber, he said to me, well, what about Tariq Ali? And of course, Tariq is a brilliant journalist, but the story didn't fit. Pakistani, rich family, Oxbridge educated, sort of gilded spoon all the way. It didn't fit with the struggle. But in terms of the fact that he worked with Darcus Howe, I could bring him in, like I brought in the figures like CLR James. So it was difficult between who to choose between CLR and Padmore, actually. But the reason I went for Padmore was because, A, his story isn't very well known. There's only one historian, academic, Elaine James, who's done a really comprehensive study on Padmore. And he sweated. He stayed in this country during the Second World War while it was being bombed and sweated to get his story out. You know, he worked really hard. He was at the Ministry of Defence, he was at the press office, he was, you know, sending out communications. He was writing for the Chicago Tribune constantly. Whereas CLR, he became a respected author and playwright, and he went to America. But the way CLR pops up again is when he's, you know, in his nephew's, in his flat above his nephew, when he's producing Race Today. So I thought that was a way to get him in, but it was so difficult to get all the characters in, you know, and there were so many wonderful people.
I think this would be a nice time actually to just do a reading, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Share something from the book.
I'll stick to a very, very short, and this is the first chapter. This is, I hope you can hear me okay, just recovering from a chest thing. So this chapter's called The Forgotten Angel of History. Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards had a column that he called The Angel of History in his newspaper. And he was a stowaway, he was a seaman, a racial justice campaigner, and, according to Peter Fryer, Britain's first black editor of note. He published Lux, 1892 to 1904, and Fraternity in 1893 to 94. Raglan Hall, 16th of December, 1882. There had been many great acts at this venue. Harry Sampson, billed as the funniest man in London, had graced this stage, as had Professor Hottaine's wonderful performing dogs and monkeys. Tonight's seasonal entertainment promised much, and the large auditorium buzzed with anticipation. In the front rows, the long wooden benches were crammed with working men in stiff flannels and derby hats. Some stamped their feet, others took up this percussion, rapping the wooden benches with their knuckles or clapping their hands. Young women in their most fashionable outfits, silk bustle gowns in nightshade and mazarine, leaned over the balcony of the upper circle, riling those below, the reflections from the mother-of-pearl buttons adorning their bodices, sending a frantic moonbeam dance across the stage. The warm-up act was the Primitive Methodists. They had secured a prime spot to deliver the message of Christ to an audience that lived in one of the most neglected districts in South London. This hall held more than 2,000 people. The young missionary who was about to take the stage first tonight was nervous. He had never faced such a large crowd before. The heavy velvet curtains provided a barrier he was not willing to dispense with just yet. Slowly, he edged forward, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The rows of faces that greeted him reminded him of the ocean's vastness, for before arriving on these shores, he spent many years at sea. In the gas lamp light, the men's features at the front of the stage seemed to distort like watery moons, as their jaws moved frantically in a most extraordinary manner. The missionary walked to the centre of the stage, but before he could open his mouth, a hail of brown, pulpy substance of objectionable odour saluted him. His fellow missionaries gasped as he was driven several steps backwards by the pellet's onslaught. "Go and teach your brother in your own country," growled a voice. The front row stamped their feet. Raucous laughter rippled across the hall and built to a crescendo. The missionary wiped his face with his jacket sleeve, staggered forward and attempted to address the audience again. The front row gobbed and hoiked once more. He slipped backwards in the snail-like musing that bathed the stage. The heckling continued, brutal and vicious, criticising his appearance. "Look at his black face. Go and have a bath. Get off, off, off. We don't want the likes of you here." His white brothers from the missionary emerged from the curtains and flapped their arms, desperately appealing for calm, but the front row again showed their vehement disdain. The hall had now descended into pandemonium. The women in the gallery started to indulge in profane dances. A sound of splitting wood came from the rear. The audience was now a wild and savage beast. Surely the young man had lost this crowd. A flash of inspiration came to him. Recollecting that music hath charms to soothe the savage breast, he quickly seated himself at the harmonium, reached tenderly for the keys, and played the hymn Cut It Down. Years spent at sea, at the mercy of its swell, and having to deal with a variety of life and death situations as a child and then as a young man, had more than prepared him for the vagaries of the Victorian music hall audience. A fellow missionary spoke later of that night. He had a marvellously beautiful touch upon the instrument and a sweet, powerful voice. The room quietened. When Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards finished, he took off his top hat and solemnly bowed to the crowd. The stunned audience pleaded with him for yet another hymn. 7 years later, Edwards' reputation had grown considerably, and people flocked to see the popular lecturer at Hackney's Victoria Park. Here he would make speeches at the Forum, a makeshift stage situated in the shadow of the ornate Gothic Burdock Coots fountain. On 26th of May 1889, the first of that year's open-air lectures, he was presented with a new podium, a great honour, as the list of those who had spoken at what was commonly known as People's Park read like a roll call of famed orators. George Bernard Shaw, William Morris, Annie Besant and Belle Tillett, as well as speakers from the Independent Labour Party, all had graced its stage.
Wow. I love that. One of the things, when I read a book, I always look for something that kind of surprises me. And I love the beginning of that reading because it talks obviously about him being a stowaway, and then you get a strong sense of the sea being a part of his kind of lived experience. And when I was reading the book, it just felt like the sea kept reoccurring throughout as a kind of it was almost a protagonist in the book, and it really reminded me of Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic, and this idea of black modernity being shaped by ships, by ports, by ocean crossings, and that kind of circulation of culture and politics. And I wondered, were you kind of conscious of that when you were writing?
I wasn't conscious of that when I was writing, but I must say that's a brilliant question and such a beautiful metaphor. And I think the sea has shaped Guyanese people. It's certainly shaped my parents in terms of like travelling across the Atlantic and the sort of double migrations that we endured in our heritage. And yeah, I think with the fact that, you know, the plantation economies for many of these journalists, you know, it was destroyed. Samuel Jules Celestine Edwards, it was a dream. You know, he ran away when he was 11. Like I said, it's an amazing story. And I do think real life throws up stories that sometimes rival that of fiction, if you look deeply. And, you know, he was a stowaway and he ran away when he was 11. But a lot of the journalists, like Padmore, he left because he wanted to make a better life for himself. Una Marston, she was determined to be a playwright. So she left. But it was because of these sort of plantation societies that, you know, the economies had been ruined. They've got the effects of, you know, an enslavement economy, you know, that everything's been sucked out and taken out of it. But they had to go abroad to find their fortunes. So I think that's part of it. But I certainly wasn't conscious of the sea when I wrote it, but I do like that idea of the Black Atlantic.
Well, it just really struck me. I most of you probably don't realise this, but I do a lot of work at the National Maritime Museum on black seafarers, and at the moment I'm trying to build up follow the different routes that people will have travelled around the Caribbean, and it's just extraordinary, the constellation of different routes. And I'd read Paul Gilroy's book before, but I hadn't really understood how vital the sea was in terms of the transmission of black culture across and ideas and, you know, just lives. And they're working on the sea, they're migrating there, you know, and all of that really came through strongly in the book. I think you even talk about like the Seamen's Hostel or something. Chris Brathwaite, there's like the trade unionists and things like that. So I found that really fascinating. But what I really wanted to know from you is kind of what do you hope younger readers, especially those from the Caribbean diaspora, what do you hope they're going to take away from the book?
I hope they'll stand a little taller, knowing this history and knowing this heritage. It's a problem when history isn't archived and put in museums or educational institutions or treated properly. You know, it reshapes the political memory. It's not known, for example, the Caribbean contribution to the World Wars, or, you know, the colonies' contribution to the World Wars even. And Hussein Muhammad Ali was constantly highlighting this. He was constantly saying this, you know, if we partake in these wars, we should experience the freedoms therein. Okay, so I'm hoping the younger generations will stand taller because of this book, to know what their ancestors did, and, you know, in a time of such overt and blatant racism. And I'm also hoping, you know, because, like you've mentioned, there are many untold stories, that they will be you know, inspired to go and do their own quest and their own search for people, and to also record the histories of those people around us. So I was talking to my colleague at The Guardian this week, and we were talking about the Caribbean community, and we used to run a thing called Black Lives after 2020, and we stopped doing it, and we were saying, well, maybe we need to resuscitate that, because we need to get these stories of the elders back into the newspapers so that we've got that history and we keep it for, you know, eternity.
I think the thing as well that was interesting for me is that I did know some of the characters, but actually they're siloed into particular areas of history. So, you know, I think of Claude McKay as a poet. I had no idea that he was here in the UK as a journalist. Or, you know, even Una Marsden, thinking of her, the BBC Caribbean Voices, but really not knowing a lot about the other roles. So it was kind of interesting that the book actually pulls together people we know of in different fields, but not understanding that actually they played this massive role as journalists. I think
I mean, I think that's really important. I mean, Claude McKay, you know, he's a brilliant poet, brilliant writer, an extremely funny person as well, an extremely funny individual. And you get to, you know, when you spend time with them, you get to like them a lot as people. And, you know, he came over to Britain to escape what was going on in America. And in America, there'd been a massive demobilisation of soldiers after the First World War. And the black soldiers who had been demobilised, they demanded that they would get equal rights. They came back to America, and there was just still segregation. It was awful, and, you know, lynching was going on at a high extent. And there was a thing called the Red Summer, which we may not know about over here, but it was like 4 months in 1919, from May to September, where you had riots across the United States in 26 towns and cities. Claude McKay was working on the railroad, so the railroad did a vital war mission, And he saw all this going on, and they couldn't come, as a black man, he couldn't get off the railroad in case they got lynched, because he'd see all this stuff. And then so he escaped to the UK because he wanted his poetry published in the UK. And when he came to the UK, the same thing was happening here. We had the riots of 1919 happening here. Mm-hmm. And again, that's faded from the historical memory. And Sylvia Pankhurst, a lot of the time you'll see a lot of amazing women working for progressive racial justice movements as well. And she met up with them. They had this amazing partnership, and that she wrote, wouldn't you be better off, arguing with your employer rather than stabbing a black man in the Docklands? And the situation has echoes to the present. So the riots that went on in last year and this year, people need to realise that certain people aren't your enemy and work together for it.
I think the other thing that's really good about the book is we've been hearing a lot of late about the Windrush generation, and everybody sort of behaving as though people turned up in Britain from 1948 onwards. And what's so lovely about that book is you get a strong sense of the intellectual kind of tradition that was in Britain, from at least the 1900s onwards.
Yeah.
So you get a much better sense of the history and the shoulders people have had to stand on long before 1948 and the sort of black presence that was here in Britain.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, what people don't realise is 1930s London, there was a huge black presence. There was restaurants, you had Amy Ashwood Garvey, you had CLR, you had the movement about the Abyssinian invasion going on as well. So, there was a huge black presence here in the 1930s. Ultimately, with the war, people did dissipate, they did, but that has been forgotten to history, like you say, and I hope this book does something to redress that.
So one last question for you then, what's next?
So yes, as you mentioned, I was awarded a Hawthornden Fellowship, so I've been very, very lucky with this book. It was supported by the Arts Council. It was also supported by the Society of Authors. And I was awarded a Hawthornden Fellowship, so I got to stay in a Scottish castle for a month and think. And I've never left my boys for a month, so it was quite hard. But I did it, and I was trying to think of another story. The story that always keeps coming back to me is the story of a healer. And this would be a work of fiction, but it was published by an Irish magazine. It was a short story that I wrote, and I always say, well, only the Irish liked it, because nobody else published it. But I think they've got a good literary tradition, and I liked it. It was when I went to Guyana when I was 9, and there was a lady called Longo, and I don't know, I'd been riding on a bike, but I got a rusty bit of metal stuck in me. And she was a traditional sort of Obeah healer, and for some reason that story stuck in my head. So I might make that short story into a little novella. You never know.
Well, we look forward to that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Yvonne.
Thank you.